Welcome back to the Self-Employment podcast. Last episode, we were able to talk about my business, my clothing company, Lion, and dive into that. And in the previous episode, we dove into Ringster. And so in this episode, we're going to dive into Treehouse Talks. My name's Jackson Oakes, and I'm here with the other two co-hosts, Matt Gross and Jake Bursey. So Jake, start us off. Tell us what is, give us like a 30-second synopsis. What is Treehouse Talks?
So the best way to describe Treehouse Talks would be drawing parallels with TED Talks. However, the major difference is it's more peer-to-peer, non-professional speaking platform. It's held weekly across several different, we'll call them branches or markets throughout the United States. And essentially just, if you're passionate about something or if you're concerned about something or if you're interested in something and willing to do the research and present for 10 to 12 minutes on it, you submit to whoever your local coordinator is, and they decide who's going to speak, and we go from there. So yeah, it's very similar to TED Talks. It's just not professional.
That's great. Thank you for kind of sharing that little part about it and what it's about. But let's just kind of get started on, how did you get involved with Treehouse Talks?
So it's important to note that I did not found Treehouse Talks. It wasn't my idea, and I had alluded to this briefly in, I think, our first episode, where, it's not so much if it's your idea, whether as it's more valuable if you actually help execute on something. So anyway, just to give like a 30-second preview into how I got involved. I got invited by a friend of mine from high school. She basically just said there's a lot of cool people there. It's a great environment. For extroverted people specifically, it's, if there's people in a room, extroverted people are going to succeed. So I went. There's a couple really vulnerable, talks given, and I really kind of resonated with that. Just, we live in a pretty superficial society in a lot of ways with regard to social media and keeping up your persona or public image. And I think it was just really empowering to see people be super vulnerable, kind of striking a lighter chord in really difficult topics of conversation, and how everyone was there to support, hearing different ideas or opposing ideas. I think that was really cool. So I got involved. I met Michael Neiman the first night I went there. He's one of the main guys. And then, after the next few weeks, he introduced me to Mayo Cannon and Hollis Hunt. And that took place middle of spring of last year. And Treehouse Talks had actually started the year prior. However, it was kind of shut down just due to the COVID lockdowns and gatherings. So now we're going strong, and I help lead with those three guys. So yeah.
That's awesome. I think that's a really important point because, with the name of this podcast, it's the Self-Employment, not the Start a Business podcast, right? And I think something important is, being self-employed or owning a business doesn't mean you had the idea. And it's exactly as you said, you executed. And so I'm really excited for this episode because Matt and I here are trying to start a business from scratch. And I think that's an important perspective. But I think another important perspective is, just because you didn't have an idea necessarily doesn't mean it isn't a great idea. It doesn't mean you can get involved and start that business and get it going. And so I'd love for you to share just a little bit on, you've said execution. And so what have you brought to the table of Treehouse to become, someone who will own part of Treehouse or help run it or, become self-employed off of this, right? What is your impact on Treehouse Talks?
Thanks for that question. I think one thing that was unique, and I had briefly expounded upon this, I think in the second episode that we did, but basically, the value that I initially brought was I was attending. Okay, so I was just a person in the crowd, and I really enjoyed it. And then it was expressed to me by Michael specifically that they wanted to help develop it into a more mature idea, potentially some sort of business or a nonprofit, whatever it was, just more formalized so it could continue on without them. And really to start off with the value and the execution was there were certain walls that were in the way. And so I had talked a little bit about they were potentially going to do like some sort of, crowdfunding, like little fundraiser to get like a new speaker, a new like screen. Cause at this point they had just had like a janky little projector, like, I don't know, like one of those like $60 projectors and like a bed sheet that was like blowing in the wind and everything. and I offered to put in a little bit of money. Just they provided a list of things that they thought were going to help them provide a better atmosphere, a little bit more consistent, a little bit more professional. So yeah, I offered in that way, and then obviously I have some experience just in business because I've started a few businesses and I've seen a startup go to some pretty great heights in that solar company I've worked for. And so by no means am I a professional in this space, but I brought a lot of understanding on how smaller businesses can like utilize tax codes, or not the tax codes, but like just like game their tax system, and also why it's so important to focus on systems rather than goals. Because one thing that's unique about Treehouse Talks is it takes a lot of manpower to do it, and to scale it across a bunch of different markets. If you can increase the efficiency, or how, like, if you can drop the number of people that have to be directly involved every week, now you're only relying on a couple of people to succeed with fairly minimal work, rather than like 20 people running around with their heads cut off, like trying to figure out what's going on and how to get social media posts up and how to get the slide decks organized, and who should be speaking on what, and how to format that so there's a variety. So yeah, I think I just complimented the other guys' strengths. Michael's really good operationally; he understands how to get things done really quickly. Hollis is great at understanding the big picture and what people are looking for. He's an experienced design major. Mile brings a lot of like other key strengths, and he's helped manage a lot of social media presence. He has a really good grasp on like brand continuity, and so some of the major factors that are kind of falling on me would be sort of managing the finances, helping with insurances, making sure that legal structures are in place to help scale it effectively, and debating on whether or not we're going to pay people in the future as like 1099 employees, if we're going to be able to make them W-2 employees, generating alternative source of revenue without making individuals pay to come to each one of these events. That's really really important to us. So I don't know if that answers your question, but basically I'm just helping with the more back end, not really glorious fun stuff. So yeah.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing about that. Let's kind of dive into like the future. Like, what do you see? I don't know if you've talked, with your, other partners and stuff, but like, what do you see the future being with Treehouse Talks? Does it look like something to get as big as, kind of like the TED Talk realm, or, what are the other things that it might branch out to, right? Because, Treehouse Talks, obviously, kind of like a tree, like it probably is going to branch, right? There's going to be a lot of different things, I'm assuming, right?
For sure, you're exactly right. I guess that's there's a lot to that question, and the reason there's a lot to that question is because the type of entity or business that Treehouse Talks is super unique. The way you can look at it is sort of like a pyramid with like different levels, and so each level brings an additional source of value to a consumer, whether that be an individual, a business, a company, whoever. And so right now, the next steps to answer your question is keep expanding. We have a really great expansion team out of Provo. They're very connected to, collegiate or college kids around the country. So that's been a great help. And it's really, it's market by market or branch by branch. Because right now, Provo is by far the most well-produced, I guess, group. Because it's the earliest, it was the first. So we're just trying to replicate that across hundreds of different universities or cities. There's no limit to where value can be found in people expressing ideas, getting connected with each other. And so ultimately, to answer your question is, yeah, we do see this as a place. I remember one of my first talks with Michael is, he said, quote, ideally, Treehouse Talks exists everywhere in the country. Like anyone can go, obviously there's a specific demographic that we're kind of appealing to a little bit more. Just, they have more free time. These college students, they're more interested, in being socially active, if that makes sense. So yeah, we do see it expanding everywhere. The maturity of the program itself is going to be built off of that program, that free once a week or twice a month, like exposure to the brand and to this good overall experience. And then we're going to piggyback at the corporate level off of that. So ideally what that looks like is we go and consult for massive companies on how to increase their culture, and partner with small businesses across the country, help leverage them from like a authentic marketing perspective. And what I mean by that is, there's a lot of little businesses that try to do a lot of good in their community, and they deserve all the recognition and praise that all these other companies deserve, but there's not like a major entity that they can really associate themselves with to kind of get that, not clout, but get that recognition that they deserve. And so if we can help small businesses in that way, we can help, help them have some more stability. That'll be huge for us. But yeah, eventually we want it everywhere, and we want to just branch. There's no limit to what we can do with hundreds of thousands of people attending every week. So yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think it's pretty easy to see the potential here. Something I think would be valuable to dive into a little bit is, with Matt and I, we have these ideas that it's very cut and dry. We're direct sellers, right? And so it's like, I have a product, I sell it to you, right? There's a transaction, I make money, you have a product. Treehouse Talks is a little different. You have this great idea, and like you said, you have this limitless amount of value, and value is not always measured monetarily exactly. And so I think, anyone starting a business, I think something I would love for you to dive into a little more is, okay, you have people attending, you have this great culture, you have this value every week, people sharing ideas and communicating, right? Like limitless potential, limitless value. Where does this become, something you can monetize? Where do you become self-employed off of this, and without, crushing that culture you have, you don't want to step on that. And so, if you could dive into how do you take this idea and all this value you're producing and monetize it?
Mm. Yeah, that's a really great question. There's a lot of worthwhile ideas out there that, there's no real direct path of monetization, right? So we, first of all, will never charge anyone to come to, these weekly events.
Right.
Purely because we feel that there shouldn't be any inhibitor on people coming and hearing these new ideas, connecting with their peers, and ultimately potentially trying or getting the opportunity to speak on something. I think that's one of the most underwritten values that we're bringing to people, is that when they give their talk, imagine the value to that individual of being able to speak on something they're passionate about or something they're excited about or vulnerable with, in front of a few hundred of their peers, and they're celebrated for that. They're doing a great job. So to answer your question with regard to monetizing it, we'll never try to monetize the weekly. We always want there to be that baseline, sort of like the free version of, you could almost think of it as like maybe Facebook. Like there's always going to be a free version. When Mark Zuckerberg was asked, with this like new metaverse and everything, they're like, so how, what's the cost to get into it? And he said, there's always going to be a free version. Like there's always going to be something where people can get value. You're going to be able to see the posts of your friends.
Right.
You're going to find out who had a baby, who got married, who's engaged, whatever. Obviously, we're not doing the exact same thing, but there's always going to be the free version. From a monetary perspective, we're going to piggyback off of that, and that's where I'm talking about the essentially limitless potential is, if you have a few thousand people in your community that are well associated, they know someone who participated with giving a talk, you can advertise to them for other things that bring value that would have a cost of entry. So for example, this weekend actually in Provo, we're having a concert series where, for our listeners, during a Treehouse Talks, there's between 2 and 3 speakers. And then we almost always have like a musical showcase where someone talks about how they've developed music. They sing, a couple covers or original song. And by and large, they're all fantastic musicians. So we've invited, 8, I think maybe 9 of them back to host this concert series, like the first one in Provo. So there's going to be like a cost entry there. That's one example. But, that's one example in one market. Who's to say that our markets are branches or chapters? We haven't really decided. I think branches probably makes most sense, just with the continuity of the tree house or whatever, the trees. But who's to say that a bunch of places can't do that, right? And we essentially franchise it out to these people, help provide the network of how everything's organized, and they should kind of run from there. That's the way more technical issue that we're running into, is how do we get 10,000 people involved, because obviously we can't pay 10,000 people $50K if we're not making that much money, right? So that's one way. We really think that once we build a larger national platform, it's going to be something that people are sad to miss out on. And what I mean by that is if I'm a student, in Utah and I get a job in Silicon Valley, and maybe the company I work for is cool, but every week I'm missing out on this awesome opportunity where I can really just no holds bar, hear what people want to say, hear what people have to say. So if we can take that to the company level where we help develop the culture there, this like free flowing communication throughout the hierarchy of major corporations, I think there's going to be a lot of value there. So we essentially go from this social platform to a cultural consulting platform that can help support smaller businesses, running special events for a fee or a nominal fee. Yeah, I think that's going to be one of our biggest issues, though, is there's so many ways we could monetize it, but keeping close to the brand, actually trying to bring value to individuals is going to be the toughest part. But it's a cool thing to stress about. So, yeah.
Well, I've got a question that kind of just popped up in my head, actually. I don't know if this has ever been asked or anything, but so, per week you probably get on average, what, 200 people, like 250? Yeah. About 250 people actually attending, right? And so back when Treehouse Talks was actually really small, people were probably a lot more confident to actually go up in front of, only like 50 to 100 people, maybe even less than that. How are you going to be able to help people overcome their fear of actually public speaking? Because that, if you're literally having people attend 200 plus, it's a big public speaking event. And I know a lot of people have, problems speaking like that, and they were more comfortable when it was smaller. So if it ever does grow past, 300, 400 people, are you going to like split into two different areas? Or are you going to like keep it kind of smaller for people? Or are you going to kind of keep it growing? And then if people are comfortable, they can keep coming back and actually giving talks.
Okay, so a few things there. With regard to splitting it in a specific location, I don't think that will ever happen unless it just logistically became too difficult. We wouldn't split it by frame of people are just nervous to speak in front of 600 or 700 people rather than 100, 200 people. I think there's a lot of value in keeping a community engaged in the same way every time, and so it would just be really hard logistically to run two separate events. You'd have to double the amount of speakers, and to be honest, there's a lot of speakers that, if you're willing to speak in front of 300 people, in my mind, you're probably willing to speak in front of 600 people. One thing that's really interesting, and I'm super happy you touched on this, Matt, is we've actually talked about this as a lot of our other chapters across the country start to develop, right? Because almost always they start when they're, like we call them like seedlings. They have like, a couple dozen people at most the first few weeks or a couple months. And then they kind of start, naturally growing. They bring their friends. And for sure, yeah, I mean, if you're only speaking in front of your friends, 10 or 20 people, it's going to be a lot easier because they have your back. One of the unique things about Treehouse Talks, though, is that, like, that's sewn into the fabric of what we're doing is it's okay if everyone in the audience has your back to some degree. Not everyone's a fan of public speaking, right? So, in my experience, everyone's pretty excited to see anyone speak about almost anything. Anyway, where I was getting though is to address that issue of people being fearful. Being fearful of giving a talk in front of a significant crowd. This is one of the things that we're going to take to the corporate world, but it's almost like individual consulting. We're going to help them understand how to speak better. That's something that's going to be advertised at each event, hopefully in the future, is, our MC gets up there and says, hey, for any of you that would like to, fill out this QR code or this form, if you'd like to speak, don't worry about being afraid of public speaking. We will have someone there to help you understand how to speak more confidently, all of those things. So basically just giving these speakers an additional resource in kind of mitigating their fears, because there are people that are terrified of public speaking that could say something that is super profound or valuable for everyone else to hear. And in fact, a pretty common, probably once a week, you'll hear a speaker get up there and say, like, I'm really nervous right now. But, like anything that you're anxious about, as soon as it starts, it almost always just goes away. So, yeah, for those of you that would be terrified of speaking in front of a lot of people, I wouldn't be too worried about that because there's people on your side. And honestly, everyone in the crowd and then the audience is going to be pretty stoked that you got up there and said anything anyway. I think that's one of the unique things about our generation is that we're actually far more accepting than people would probably give us credit for.
That's awesome, dude. One last question I would ask then would be, what are your practical next steps over like the next few weeks maybe, right? Real short term, like what is it, you have this brand that grows really organically and you guys have quite a bit of traction right now, you're scaling. And so that was a nice like overview, but I'm curious about the nitty gritty, like what, next week are you doing for Treehouse Talks? And then the week after that, like what are your very practical, next steps for this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I can't speak necessarily for what the leadership team, there's the 4 of us, are doing individually. What I can say for myself is, developing this legal or more corporate structure. Because right now we're just a general liability company and we're working on pursuing a general liability policy just so we can help, reduce the issues with finding indoor venues. Because if you can show someone you have a couple $1 million policy, they're way more likely to be, oh yeah, you can use our venue, this is fine. But the nitty gritty is, I've been working with a few lawyers to help understand what we can do from a compensation standpoint once we do start to develop these, consistent revenue sources, how we can make it worth it to some degree for all those, college kids across the country running things. That's way more holistic. That's a lot more complex than I can really get into on this podcast. But as far as the kind of the nitty gritty for everything else is constantly we're interviewing and talking to people at other universities across the country and trying to select where our next where we're going to be able to provide the next best set of resources to people, whether that's 3 or 4 individuals at Northern Arizona University, for example. We know someone really well, but we also know a few other people who are interested enough in the same sort of thing to help support that one individual. So yeah, we're constantly reaching out. Our expansion team, shout out to Matthew Kleiman. He's dope. I love that guy. He's been helping a ton in that connection. So finding more individuals and then the leadership team works really closely with all of our other markets or chapters running and refining, getting more data, providing better social media output or outcomes. We're developing this cool thing called like a starter kit, which essentially is at the ground level, anyone could come across the starter kit and see how they can implement it in their community, regardless of if that's a university setting or one of the cool things is we have Park City, which is primarily adults, like older people attending. So it's really cool to see that. Like I said, there's no limit to who needs or who can find value in something like this. So I don't know if that answers your question, but the starter kit, we have those, paid for events that are going to help start generating a little bit of revenue. And then we're going to go from there. And yeah, I think that's really about it, other than just kind of the really boring legal stuff, setting up the insurance policies, getting those certificates out to everyone. One thing I do want to say that I think will be really cool is if we can swing it with the labor department, we'd love to have some sort of a internship program where we can provide little letters of recommendation, job experience, and you can actually pay interns, like it doesn't really matter. So that's just another thing that we're going to hopefully provide, incentivize people with the talents to help grow this thing across the country, because 4 people can't manage thousands of chapters running. They can't even manage 10 chapters running, so we have to have other people. But hopefully that works. But yeah, just advertising heading into the summer, getting more people involved, more speakers. So yeah, hopefully that works.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. I think there was some really valuable perspective shared. It's a bit of a different business model, and I think you shared some really, really cool things. We really appreciate everyone who is listening in, and thank you again, Jake, for all the perspective you shared. We hope to record Monday through Thursday every week and get you guys some good content, and we hope you enjoyed today's episode. We'll see you next time.